reading today is a video excerpt from our member of blessed memory, Ed Lane. Ed gave a series of 3 lectures at First Parish in Waltham, where he was Minister Emeritus, about the history of our national denomination's publishing house, Beacon Press. Ed was serving as chair of the Beacon Press Board in 1971, when our denomination controversially chose to publish the Pentagon Papers about the United States military involvement in Vietnam.
So we'll get into our topic tonight, picking up where we left on after the first lecture with a cliffhanger of that telephone call that I got on July 19 from Goldman Stair. We've got the Pentagon Papers. We think we should publish them. What do you think? And very quickly, the next day, 5 people were unanimous in their agreement that we should publish. I was one of those 5 as chair of the Beacon Board. Goldman as the director of the press was another. Arnold Tovell as the editor of the press was a third. Bob West as president of the UUA was a 4th. And Ray Hopkins, vice president of the UUA, was a 5th. And that agreement was done with no dissent at all. Very quickly we agreed we should publish. At that point, I think none of us, or I should say all of us, thought that publishing classified material was a crime. And as you'll see in the lecture tonight, turned out it wasn't. We had no idea. We knew the Nixon administration would come down hard on us, as they had on the New York Times and other newspapers. We did not know what they would do. But we were all aware of the fact that we could wind up being convicted of a crime. But it turned out that wasn't the case. That announcement by Senator Gravel and later by the Beacon Press resulted in a phone call at home to Goldman Stair from President Nixon. I attempted without success to obtain a written transcript of that call from the Nixon library. They said it wasn't available. I don't know how people get those tapes, but tapes are available some way. But all we have is Goldman's recollection as he remembers it. And what he remembers was that Nixon said, "Goldman, we've been investigating you around Boston, and we know you're apparently a pretty nice and smart guy. I hear you're going to do that set of papers by that guy Gravel." And then going on to suggest that he should not do it and that he would be in trouble if he did. My greatest concern was always that we could be completely exonerated by the courts, as I eventually believed we would be, though not initially, and still be bankrupt if the government chose to pit its vast financial resources against our small denominational publishing house. I wrote a sermon, I think it was in 1973, I believe, entitled "The Mouse That Roared." You remember that movie by Peter Sellers? Because this is the way I felt. We were a tiny little publishing house taking on the federal government, and they could just beat up on us and lose every case and still clobber us.
Thank you, Ed, and thank you, Tom Gaiman, for your technical assistance. Our congregation has been supported by the volunteered time and treasure of its members and friends since its founding in 1711. This is the time in our service when we ask for all of you, the modern stewards of the church, to give generously out of the blessings you've received in your life. For the month of November, we are sharing our plate collection 50-50 with the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, or UUSC. The UUSC is the merged social service organization of the Unitarian Service Committee and the Universalist Service Committee, both founded during World War II to help those escaping Nazi persecution and to support relief efforts after the war. The symbol of our denomination, the flaming chalice, comes from the Unitarian Service Committee. It was their original symbol. The UUSC today SC Today supports justice work through local partners throughout the world, with a special focus on grassroots organizing abroad and legislative advocacy here in the United States. It also is the organizational vehicle for special UU fundraising efforts after natural disasters in our country and around the world. You may remember our visit from the UUSC staff, Reverend Mary Catherine Morin, Reverend Laura Randall, and Heather Vickery, in late September this year. If you're putting in your check for your annual pledge for 2019 to 2020, please note that in the memo line. All checks should be made out to First Parish in Needham. If you are a visitor or guest this morning, please know that our worship is our gift to you and there is no obligation to contribute to our offering. But thank you for supporting the ministries of this congregation. The offering will now be generously given and gratefully received. In the worship cafe, may the basket be passed, and here in the sanctuary, may the ushers please come forward. Last week, just in time for Veterans Day, New York Times editor and journalist Carol Giacomo published a report that suicide has been deadlier than combat for the U.S. military. She wrote more than 45,000 veterans and active duty service members have died by suicide in the past 6 years. That is more than 20 deaths a day. In other words, more suicides each year than the total American military deaths in Afghanistan and Iraq. The latest Pentagon figures show the suicide rate for active duty troops across all service branches rose by over a third in 5 years. And in 2016, veterans were 1.5 times more likely to die by suicide than people who hadn't served in the military. And the risk nearly doubled in the first year after a veteran left active duty. When I think about honoring our veterans, my heart is often pulled toward tragic numbers like these. Many of our service members return home with severe physical injuries, including of the brain, mental health disorders, including post-traumatic stress disorder, and horrific memories of being shot at, seeing colleagues and friends hurt or killed, or missions gone wrong against unintended targets like civilians and children. And after veterans return home, they may be greeted with the thank you for your service, But many also notice the news reports and conversation among family and friends that draw into question whether our current incursions in Afghanistan, Iraq, and elsewhere have done anything positive to secure freedom and safety over there or right here in America. It is the ongoing work of political scientists, philosophers, and theologians to determine when, if ever, there is a just war. From a religious perspective, the Roman Catholic Church has a well-defined and popularly cited understanding of whether a war is just. First, a nation must have just reasons for entering war, and then a nation must conduct war against another nation in a just manner. As examples, Catholic jus ad bellum includes having right intention, competent governmental authority, a high probability of success, and that war was a last resort. Jus in bello includes having proportional responses, no excessively violent or destructive weaponry, distinguishing between combatants and civilians, and exercising fair treatment of prisoners of war. The horrors of war, especially an unjustified war, can result in what some psychologists and chaplains call a moral injury. The term moral injury was popularized over 20 years ago by Dr. Jonathan Shea, a Boston-based clinical psychiatrist who worked with veterans diagnosed with PTSD. He first described moral injury as he treated Vietnam War veterans specifically. Dr. Shea felt there was something different about some of his patients that couldn't be fully explained by a PTSD diagnosis. Philosophy professor Dr. Aaron Pratt Shepard writes that while some symptoms of moral injury, re-experiencing the traumatic event, sleep disturbances, self-harming activities like substance abuse and recklessness, and suicidal thoughts, overlap with those of PTSD and traumatic brain injuries, there are differences. What distinguishes moral injury is a persistent sense of guilt and shame and an ethical drift whereby veterans no longer have a clear sense of right and wrong or what makes their lives meaningful. Syracuse University's Moral Injury Project describes the scenarios in which soldiers may experience a moral injury. It's essentially a list of opposites from jus ad bellum and jus in bello. Service members may experience moral injury if they use deadly force and caused harm or death of civilians or fellow service members, gave orders that resulted in injury or death of a service member, failed to provide medical aid to an injured civilian or service member, learned of the execution of cooperating local nationals, failed to report sexual assault committed against themselves, another service member, or civilians, followed orders that were illegal or immoral, or experienced a change in belief about the necessity or justification for the war. Japanese-American theologian Dr. Rita Nakashima Brock says, "In war, it's often your job to do those things that violate everything you were taught was wrong. Moral injury afflicts ordinary moral people when no good choice is possible. Moral injury is the feeling that it is no longer possible to be good anymore. It is the loss of the capacity for trust and empathy, of a sense of meaning, and even of faith." These spiritual, emotional, and physical wounds are not unfamiliar to us who have lived through the ongoing Iraq and Afghanistan years, and certainly not to those who lived through the Vietnam era. There are just war questions for all these military actions, like, did we send our troops for valid reasons? Were our actions a proportional response to harm done against our nation? Did we treat civilians and prisoners fairly? And I do want to take a small Unitarian Universalist historic detour as we think about moral injury and the Vietnam War. In 1967, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara gathered a team of 36 analysts to draft a full history of the U.S. decision-making on Vietnam beginning in the 1940s. The 7,000-page report would become known as the Pentagon Papers. The papers detailed, though unknown to the American public, that the United States had been secretly involved in Vietnam's affairs since the 1950s, that the CIA helped depose Vietnam's former president, that the government was using the war in Vietnam to contain China and Soviet communism, not to liberate South Vietnam, and later that the government continued with the war simply not to embarrass ourselves with a military loss, that the United States had expanded its bombing campaigns into neighboring Cambodia and Laos, and that a succession of presidential administrations had lied to the public about these facts, all while we deployed nearly 3.5 million American service members to Vietnam. Daniel Ellsberg, who worked at the think tank Rand Corporation, began smuggling the Pentagon Papers out of his company in October 1969, 50 years ago last month. In 1971, Ellsberg began leaking the documents to friends and contacts at various national newspapers, most famously at the New York Times and the Washington Post, as we recently saw in a star-studded movie. But the Nixon administration went after the newspapers, and none could publish the Pentagon Papers in its entirety. So Ellsberg began looking for the right congressperson to leak the papers to. Around the same time, Senator Mike Gravel, a Unitarian Universalist from Alaska, attempted to filibuster renewal of the draft. Ellsberg felt like he'd found his right congressperson. Another Unitarian Universalist, Ben Bagdakian, was the journalist at the Washington Post who'd known Ellsberg when they both worked at the Rand Corporation. Bagdakian was asked to help Ellsberg deliver the Pentagon Papers over to Senator Gravel. Gravel then placed the Pentagon Papers into the public record through his chairmanship of the Senate's Building and Grounds Subcommittee, of all subcommittees. However, a fellow senator blocked funding for a Senate stenographer to type up the Pentagon Papers, and Ellsberg's plans for the papers to become publicly available were thwarted once again. Senator Gravel approached 36 publishers with the Pentagon Papers and was turned down by every one. Then one of Gravel's aides reminded him of his own denomination's publishing house up in Boston. The Unitarian Universalist Association's Beacon Press had already published books that condemned the United States' involvement in Vietnam by folks like socialist historian Howard Zinn. So Gravel called Beacon Press to ask if we were interested. As we heard from our own Ed Lane in his lecture about the Pentagon Papers, Beacon Press and the UUA decided to take up the challenge. Beacon Press director Govind Stair recalled, other publishers had turned down the manuscript, both for commercial reasons and out of fear. And as a free press, we felt we had a responsibility to publish needed information when others would not. Senator Gravel told our denominational magazine, the UU World, nobody would touch the papers. Nobody but the Unitarians. So that really locked me in. I'm Unitarian, and I'm damn proud of it. They've got courage. I'm very loyal to the Unitarian Church for what they did. In 1971, publishing the Pentagon Papers was a huge financial risk for us because our denomination was in very bad financial shape. The UUA president at the time, Reverend Bob West, was narrowly avoiding bankruptcy by cutting funding and programming. Some of you may have attended our September Lane Lyceum on the so-called Black empowerment controversy, which included in 1970 the UUA reneging on promised funding to Black Unitarian Universalist activists and organizers. This was all part of our far-reaching financial problems. The Veach funding program out of the Shelter Rock Unitarian Universalist congregation on Long Island loaned $100,000 to Beacon Press as working capital as they published the Pentagon Papers. Beacon Press also received smaller donations from rival publishing houses who had turned the Pentagon Papers down. Beacon Press is the only publisher who ever published the complete Pentagon Papers, and the 4-volume set of the papers was released in mid-October 1971. The federal government was displeased with us. On October 29, 1971, 2 FBI agents appeared at the New England Merchants National Bank, where our national denomination and Beacon Press had their accounts. With a grand jury blanket subpoena, the agents asked for all UUA records, copies of every check written and every check deposited by the UUA between June 1st and October 15th. That is a good record of every person who was donating to the UUA. In addition to a personal threatening phone call from President Nixon, as we heard about from Ed's video, Ed Lane's own phone was at his church office, was tapped by the FBI, and an enormous file was collected on him. There were court cases and grand jury trials against Senator Gravel, Daniel Ellsberg, and Beacon Press. Our denomination's legal fees were astonishing, as Ed feared. And we were not making much money from our 4-volume Pentagon Papers set. Then in the summer of 1972, the Supreme Court decided that Senator Gravel's congressional immunity did not protect Beacon Press. Our national leaders were quite afraid of what would happen next. The government may have continued its campaign against our denomination if the executive branch didn't end up with something else to worry about that same summer. The break-in at the Watergate Hotel. U.S. forces withdrew from Vietnam in 1973, and President Nixon resigned his office in 1974, just prior to his likely impeachment. It's our Unitarian Universalist historic detour. I bring up the Pentagon Papers, yes, because they are an important part of our denominational history, but also because the content of that report demonstrated how unjust the war in Vietnam was, how wrong it was for us to send our young soldiers there to kill and to die. We did not go in for the right reasons. Our response was not proportional. We used horrific weapons, and horrific violence was visited upon our own troops, too. And Vietnam veterans were terribly mistreated when they returned home for a war they didn't start and didn't choose to continue. The prevalence of moral injury was high and the effects long-lasting. And it seems we're seeing a similar moral injury prevalence with our service members and veterans today. From Dr. Rita Nakashima Brock again, moral injury is not a personal disorder of a few veterans. It is the normal response of moral people to experiences of violence that cannot be integrated or understood, that shatter moral foundations, and that require long processing and reflection to understand and integrate so that hope for the future can be restored and life to flourish. This processing is not something anyone can do alone, but with honest friends and a better society that we make together, it is possible. I wondered how we as a faith community within the broader American society can support our veterans who are suffering from such spiritual wounding. Editor Kirsten Grace Simmons wrote a summary of a U.S. Army retreat on moral injury, the first of its kind that took place this spring. At it, Chaplain Major Jonathan Entrinkin made his approach clear from the outset. Healing moral injury requires neither a specific faith nor any religious faith at all, he said. It is based entirely on setting oneself right with their moral conviction and community. Thus, a common treatment for moral injury is to reconnect veterans with their larger community through ethics-based service. A loving faith community of compassion, honesty, forgiveness, and atonement can be a key component of healing from moral injury. For those of us who are not veterans or who have not experienced moral injury, truly the best we can do is not send our service members into war, especially not one with dubious ethical foundations and conduct. We can make our voices heard for peace and justice through protests, legislative lobbying, and at the ballot box. But when the worst happens and we deploy troops into the next Vietnam, the next Afghanistan, the next Iraq, we can treat our returning veterans with respect and kindness for the trauma our society has inflicted upon them, and help them reconnect with community through relationship and social service. On this Veterans Day weekend, may we recommit to justice and peace, and may we work to end all wars and violence. And until the time of that beautiful future, may we care for our service members and veterans, as is our responsibility as their neighbors. Blessed be, and amen.